Hi, everybody. This is Tony Gurule with Radical Truth. I'm a missionary speaker and trainer, and I have with me here Olin Giles, who's a missionary speaker and trainer as well. And we welcome you back to Radical Truth in association with Why Christianity, which is Olin's YouTube channel, which is growing steadily. So we thank God for that. We thank God for you guys who are tuning in and watching videos and sharing them and commenting and so on. So if you don't know, if you have not joined us for the last 3 chapters, we are actually going through a book of one of our professors, Dr. Daniel Janosik, The Guide to Answering Islam. And we're trying to do 1 chapter a month. We've been super busy traveling, speaking at conferences, doing interviews, and so on, and doing schoolwork. We're both in seminary right now, so we're very busy. However, we are getting to chapter 4 now, finally. We have the first 3 chapters on Olin's channel. They are still to come on the main Radical Truth channel. However, you can find all of our work overall at radicaltruth.net, and that is where it has links to all the different video platforms that we're on, all the podcast platforms that we're on, and of course, that's where you can find the first 3 chapters of this series that we're working on currently. Again, this is chapter 4. Olin, please introduce yourself to anyone who doesn't know about you and let them know what the title of chapter 4 is.
All right. Well, thank you, Tony, for joining me today. And I'm also a missionary trainer and speaker with Radical Truth Ministries, and I've had the pleasure of doing this all year now. I had no idea what I was going to do January 1st of this year, and I look up and it's October. And I've been doing this all year long. I just got back from Florida, so praise God that allowed me to do that. And just an honor and a privilege to be a part of this ministry. I love it, and I know we've mentioned this several times, but I think it's just pretty neat to bring it up again. I can't help but think about me and you being in Dearborn, Michigan, with Joe Carey, and both of us were with Radical Truth. Both of us were with Ratio Christi at the
Yep.
time. And I had no idea that Joe would pass away, and now here we are, both of us with Radical Truth, and of course Joe is gone. But
We need to
again,
share that. We need to share that picture too. I'll probably put it in the upcoming newsletter just to fill
yeah,
people in. So
yeah, really, that was that was when God really gave me a heart for Dearborn, Michigan, and I just couldn't wait to go back. But anyhow, chapter 4 today, the title of the chapter is "The Origin of Islam: New Path to God or a Jewish Christian Heresy." And as many of our viewers know, probably this is a pretty controversial topic right now. This whole idea that did Muhammad exist, and we're going to touch on that a little bit today, and perhaps look at some of the evidence for or against the existence of Muhammad. But I don't know about you, but I'm still trying to figure out where I land on this thing. I'm still taking in a lot of the evidence and still trying to figure it out. I have a paper to write for class with Dr. J. Smith, and it's taking all this material and just looking at both sides. The those who believe Muhammad did exist and those who believe he did not.
yeah,
And
and the
it's
and the yeah, and the day that debate took place, I was hoping to have this video out before the debate started. Unfortunately, I recorded it that morning, day of the debate, and then the video came out that evening. However, it's called and it's on the main RT channel, and that is Dr. J. Smith versus Raymond Ibrahim. I think that the main title of it though is before and after the debate, and then it says J. Smith and Raymond Ibrahim, because in it I have a number of slides that I share with you and I let people know what they need to know before the debate and afterwards. And of course, in there, I told people that I'm pretty much neutral on the answer to the question, because I've known Raymond Ibrahim actually, I think, longer than I've known Dr. J. Smith. Um, and knowing both of them personally, and knowing that this is a major topic that they both specialize in, it's like, hey, it's like I'm totally interested in the question. I'm totally interested in the evidence on both sides. But because I know both of them, I'm like, hey, I'm neutral on who wins or loses the debate per se. And also, I said, hey, I'm thinking about here and now. Whether Muhammad existed or not, there are 6 things that are still going to happen throughout the world, and there's 2 things that need to happen. And I said, it doesn't matter if he existed or not. This is what people need to realize, because even if he didn't exist, 1.8 billion Muslims aren't going to just leave Islam tomorrow. And if they did, and they just said, "Oh, Islam's not true, I'm going to leave it," well, that makes this world a better place, but just a better place to go to hell from. Because if they don't hear the gospel and understand it, and they don't repent and put their trust in Christ, then leaving Islam didn't help them ultimately. Again, just made the world a better place or a safer place. So anyway, I'm kind of like practically minded about here and now, whether he existed or not. But I'm enjoying all the material. I'm enjoying the back and forth, and I know that we're talking about that topic here today too. So
Yeah, I mean, of course, I agree with all of that, and I understand those points. But I've taken a liking for history. Really, I mean, I didn't care much for history in high school, but I've really enjoyed, just examining this historical evidence. Whether it supports the idea of a 7th century Muhammad or not. I want to get to the truth. I want to get to what the evidence points to. And of course, that's what I'm trying to do in my paper. But
yeah,
anyhow, we're going to look at a little bit of that evidence today. That is part of chapter 4. And of course, Dr. Daniel Janosik works pretty close with Dr. J. Smith. And this is a topic that they talk about quite a bit. But in the introduction to this chapter, Dr. Janosik really presents this question here. He wants to know, like we do, what really happened in the first 60 years of Islam. I mean, this is a historical question, and this is that one that we can ask. I mean, there's nothing wrong with asking this question. There's nothing wrong with examining the historical evidence for the existence of Muhammad. I think there's a place for it, but the traditional Muslim account says that the faithful Muslims in the 7th century spread their new faith militarily. This is, of course, the standard Islamic narrative. They would say that things were pretty much settled, and Islam spread pretty rapidly through the military of the first 4 caliphs. But the revisionist scholars would say that there was a mixed military religious series of raids in a religion that was still being finalized. It was still in flux, and it doesn't, reach the Quran doesn't reach a standardized text. The standard Islamic narrative does not, become what it is today until much later. And I think, honestly, I think that's what the evidence points to. But anyhow, any thoughts on that opening part there, Tony, before we move on?
I remember you and I taking apologetics to Islam with Dr. Janosik back in 2011 or so. So I know that he's been sharing this side-by-side comparison for quite a while about, hey, this is the traditional story. This is what you need to know, because there are many Christians who don't. And in fact, there's a lot of Muslims who don't even know the whole traditional story and the horror of it, just according to Islam's primary sources about how Islam spread and so on. But just to think about, okay, if Christianity is true, which we have all evidence in the world to know that it is, Islam's automatically false, and therefore any theological claim according to the traditional story of Islam is false. So obviously there is a alternative story other than the traditional one of what really happened. And this is just the opening to hey, we have to look at the revisionist scholars in addition to the traditional story and make the comparison there.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I think there's evidence to support both sides, and I think I don't know. I'm a little surprised that it's such a big controversy, and I'm a little surprised that um, some YouTubers are are taking the route that we shouldn't go down this path. But I just don't see anything wrong with looking at this historical evidence for the existence of Muhammad and taking it all in as we should and reaching a conclusion about whether he existed or not. I understand that Islam is going to carry on and there are still issues to deal with regardless, but I think we can make these historical arguments and perhaps we should. All right, so we're going to begin with the traditional Muslim view of this transition from prophet to empire. And Dr. Janosik says on page 52 that the prophet's death, which was rather sudden, also created an immediate need for his followers to appoint a new leader. And I remember the first time that I learned this fact, I found it rather odd that, at Muhammad's death, that there really was no standardized Quran. There doesn't seem to be any kind of you know plan in place for what's going to happen after he is no longer there. And of course, we have the first four caliphs here on the screen: Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ibn Ali, Talib, and again, these leaders are come after Muhammad, and they are known as caliphs or Khalifa or Khalifa. Maybe
Yeah.
that wrong. Khalifa, the right pronunciation. And this word just means successor or the next in line. But again, I just thought it was really, really strange that Islam would, document the fact that they didn't have any plan in place. Muhammad dies suddenly, and it's like they're scrambling to figure out who's going to take over and fill his shoes, so to speak.
And then for anyone who's not aware, but have of what it is, but they've heard of this battle between the Sunnis and Shias, which are still going on today, although they're working together in the West, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and because of the Islamization of the West being the goal, they do work together to a degree. Obviously, Saudi Arabia and Iran don't get along because you have Sunni and Shia, but Ali there, 656 to 661, the relative of Muhammad, basically when he got into office, quote unquote, basically that is where Shias say, oh, he was the first legitimate successor because he was actually a blood relative of Muhammad, where the Sunnis, which are roughly 90% of Muslims in the world, don't care about giving any special status to a blood relative of Muhammad, because for them it's just all about whoever's voted in, kind of like majority rule. So Sunnis look to all four of these successors as legitimate, where Sunnis say no, that fourth one, Ali, he's the first real legitimate successor. And again, that's the Sunni Shia split, and of course, that's the topic that people are now talking about. Because if you got to question the existence of Muhammad, okay, how did the Sunni Shia split come about? So then there's back and forth on that as well. But that again, traditional story, first four successors, and Islam spread all over the place under Muhammad and these four successors.
And I do think that's a legitimate question. I think it's an excellent question. You have to explain this Sunni Shia divide and how it happened. And I thought that was, well, we all expected Raymond Ibrahim to make that point in the debate, but I think it's a good point, and I think it's something that needs to be explained and thought through. But just thinking about Uthman there as well too. Everybody's probably familiar with him. He's pretty famous for
the Quran burner.
Yeah, collecting the variant Qurans, and burning them and then standardizing the text and sending it out. Again, this is rather embarrassing testimony that
and it's the traditional one, the traditional
right,
story.
Yeah. Right.
The traditional story is that he burned Quranic manuscripts. In other words, if there's contradictions here, well, I'll destroy the evidence so that all we have is the one that I like. I mean, that's the traditional story according to Islam itself.
Yeah. So at least by 656 AD, you still don't have a standardized Quran by their own sources. They're admitting this much. So just something to think about and take in as we look at some of the evidence. But there are a lot of historical problems with this idea of the first four caliphs. And Dr. Janosik brings out these points in the book. He says there are no rock inscriptions in the 7th century using the term caliph. Instead, we find the phrase commander of the faithful, which of course does not necessarily speak of a successor. So this term caliph is coined much later. It doesn't appear on the historical setting, so to speak, until later. We have mention of Abu Bakr. Agapius of Hierapolis from the 10th century mentions him. But look at the later dates of these the people who are mentioning these first four caliphs. We again, from a historical perspective, this is not really good. Umar, Theophanes the Confessor's Chronicle, 810 A.D. Uthman, I mean, this is one of the most important caliphs in the traditional Islamic story. There's no references to him before the 9th and 10th century. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't exist, but again, it's just it's something that we have to consider from a historical perspective. Same thing with Ibn Ali Talib. References for him begin in the 9th and 10th century. And of course, this is the golden period of Islam. And you would think that someone would have mentioned these early leaders much, much earlier. I mean, you would think somebody would be writing about these four men who are part of this traditional narrative and are known as caliphs. And of course, I got a picture of Ali here on the screen that I took while I was in Dearborn.
I was going to say, that looks Dearbornish right there.
Yeah.
Pictures all over the place. As a lot of people probably are unaware that although Dearborn is very high Muslim concentration, it's interesting because the majority of Muslims there are actually Shia, which is the minority of Muslims in the world, not the smallest minority, because you have even smaller sects of Islam than the Shia. But you figure the two major branches are Sunni, which is, again, roughly 85 to 90%, where the Shia is the second largest. But again, you're talking 10%, maybe a little more, maybe a little bit less. So it's interesting because the highest concentration of Muslims in Michigan, of course, especially, is Dearborn, and some people say that's the highest in the U.S. But to have that dynamic of the highest Muslim concentration being the minority, because I've asked Muslims who live in that area who are from the Middle East, I asked them, I said, if every Shia in Dearborn was actually a Sunni, how do you think the atmosphere would be different? And there's some people who said, oh, I think that Dearborn would be like Europe, because they, according to them, Sunnis are that much more aggressive than Shias are. So anyway, an interesting dynamic for having the highest concentration be, again, a minority group.
Yes. And of course, we want to point out that it seems like everything starts with this fifth Umayyad Caliph, Abdul Malik. It was during his reign, 685 to 705, that Islam gained control of the former Byzantine territories in the Middle East. He's pretty famous for initiating the construction of the Dome of the Rock. And he was the first to mint coins with the form of the Shahada on them. And he also, lastly, he began the process of making Arabic the official language of the empire. So all of these things brought a new level of prominence to Islam. But if you look at the date, again, during his reign, 685 to 705, this is when everything seems to take place. So from a historical perspective, we want to question why. You know, why do all of these things suddenly appear on the scene with this guy named Abdel Malik? And again, I think that's a legitimate historical question. Why is there very little evidence for the first four caliphs, and then suddenly we have Abdul Malik come on the scene, and we have all of these things that are associated with Islam, which suddenly appear? From a historical perspective, it looks suspect. So we'll transition now to the counter view of the transition from prophet to empire, and we have a few quotes here from the book of Robert Spencer. Did Muhammad exist? This is a do you know when he wrote this book? It's fairly old.
Yeah, I know the new edition, the second edition, came out within the last few years, I believe.
Yeah,
But the first one, I would think, mid 2000s. I think probably 2007, 8, maybe. Might have been a little bit later, but I do know the revised version
yeah.
came out probably within the last few years.
He says every empire of the day was anchored in a political theology. He makes a good point here. Every empire of the day was anchored in a political theology. The Romans conquered many nations and unified them by means of the worship of Greco-Roman gods. The realm of political theology then offers the most plausible explanation for the creation of Islam, Muhammad, and the Quran. The Arab Empire controlled and needed to unify huge expanses of territory where different religions predominated. Page 208. So he's suggesting here that it's certainly plausible that that there was a need to bring in this religious political ideology of Islam as we know it today. And of course, he elaborates on this much more in the book, but he also says on page 209 the Abrahamic monotheism, conceiving of Christ as a servant of Allah and messenger, probably reached its apotheosis in 691 in Abdul Malik's Dome of the Rock inscriptions, which could well refer to Jesus, page 209. Now, a lot of people think that's just an outrageous claim, but again, I'm still trying to figure it out. I think it's possible. I've not seen anything to prove or disprove that claim. What are your thoughts, Tony?
It just froze up a couple times when you were speaking, so I'm not sure if I got all that. But yeah, I mean, I still need to read this book by Spencer, but he basically goes into when I remember Dr. Janosik talking about, again, back then, part of our study in the class was the traditional story. At the same time, he was giving us the revisionist and neo-revisionist viewpoints of different archaeological findings, historical, numismatic, which is the coins, the epigraphal. The epigraphal is the inscriptions on the rock and buildings and so on. And with that, giving this alternative view of it being more of a not a religious growth of Islam, but more of a political. And then the religious aspect was almost kind of like in the background, and it was like a intermediate monotheism, as Dr. Janosik calls it, where it wasn't Christian, it wasn't Jewish, but it was like somewhere in between. What's also interesting is in this fourth chapter, Dr. Janosik mentioning the when I first read it, I was like, oh, Nazarenes, and I was like, wait, it's like, no, it's not Nazarenes, it's Nazorians. Nazorians being those who believe that Jesus was the Messiah, but actually still religiously followed Judaism, more than I guess your average Messianic Jew today. But
Right.
they were actually following everything in Judaism strictly, but also believing that Jesus is the Messiah. But then when you look at Islam today, and you see that there's still not only Jewish practices that are incorporated into it, as well as pagan practices that are still practiced by Islam, and yet it claims to be a refutation of pagan gods and idolatry, and even with the Kaaba supposedly being a storehouse of many gods, and then Muhammad saying, "Oh no, Allah is the one true God," and rejecting the polytheism, and yet polytheistic or pagan practices are still part of Islam today. And then, of course, Janosik goes into, and I know we're going to get it here in a few, how even with these pagan practices that are still part of Islam today, the geography and topography of Mecca doesn't line up precisely with it like Petra does, which is in a way more northern area. So again, it's still questioning this entire historical narrative of the traditional story of Islam. We already know there's a theological problem, which like I said, it totally makes sense as far as Islam being, an evolution of a uh, what do you call it, a heretical view of Christianity and or Judaism. That totally makes sense because
Yeah.
again, Christianity is true, Islam is false theologically. However, we're still putting all these pieces together as far as just the story of Islam. Even if we say, oh, Muhammad was obviously a false prophet, Allah is not the true God, the East in the Quran is not the true Jesus. Okay, so they have all the theology wrong, but how did everything else come about? So Spencer, of course, has written books on this as well. So just another resource for people.
Spencer's a smart guy too, and I think again, I'm just a little surprised that some people think this is just such an outrageous claim, but I think it's certainly plausible. I mean, we look at these inscriptions and like the Dome of the Rock and the things that they say, and there's nothing there that you know defines them as clearly Islamic as we know Islam today. I mean, they certainly could have been some form of heretical Unitarian Christian sect that believed in the one true God, believed Jesus was a Messiah, but they didn't believe he was the God Man, and so on. But
Well, it's interesting
anyhow,
too because you figure, um, what type of monk was it who supposedly told
Arian,
Muhammad?
Arian,
Well, that's who John of Damascus was referring to when he says that he learned Muhammad learned about Jesus from an Arian monk,
right,
and of course, Arian referring to Arius, recycled version of Arianism is the Watchtower and Jehovah's Witnesses,
right,
believing that Jesus is a God, he's a created being, whereas Christianity teaches he's the eternal Son of God in human flesh. In other words, although the human flesh was born and physical, the person is eternal, along with the Father and the Holy Spirit. However, in the traditional story, as far as Muhammad being told that he was a prophet because of a mole on his back, that wasn't an Arian monk. That I believe was a Nestorian monk, wasn't it?
yeah, you might be right there. Yeah,
So now we have two different heretical views of Christianity that were around because you have a Nestorian monk telling Muhammad that he's a prophet because of a mole on his back. You have an Arian monk telling Muhammad about Jesus, according to John of Damascus. So heresies were around. These heresies were already dealt with in church councils before Muhammad was even born. So it's no surprise. Like I said, let's just say that Muhammad did exist at the exact time that the sources say. We still know Islam's false theologically, and it's still interesting to figure out what heretical view specifically became the Islam that we know today.
Yeah, and I was just thinking too, it might be different if the Quran actually got Christian theology right. It might bring a different perspective to me, but when you read the Quran and what it has to say about Christianity, nowhere does it get Christian theology right. So it's like we already know it's heretical. It's not right. It's not representing Orthodox Christianity. So, but it does fit somewhat with some of the sects that were around during this time, as we've already said. So that makes the argument plausible, as far as I can tell.
Now, how often when you mention when a Muslim says, "Oh, the Quran denies the Trinity," and you say, "Well, yeah, but it denies the wrong Trinity, if you want to call it that, when it says do not say three, it's denying God, Jesus, and Mary." And then we say, "Look, that isn't Orthodox Christianity. No Christian
I
would agree
agree.
with that."
Right.
Christians would agree with the Quran that
Right.
it's not God, Jesus, and Mary.
That's right.
Now, how often do Muslims tell you, "Oh, well, there were, I forget the exact name, but there was some heretical sect out there at that time who did worship Mary," and they say, "Oh, like as if that's proof for it," but it still isn't proving or isn't denying the real Trinity. It's like the Quran is denying a heresy. It's not denying true Christianity. It's not denying the true Trinity.
Yeah, and it's if anything, it was a small heretical sect. Why would Allah focus on this small, insignificant heretical sect of Christianity, and that's His eternal word versus what really is Christianity and what we believe and what the churches believe throughout the centuries. But
Yeah.
anyhow,
And of course, putting the pieces together, the Quran has errors in it historically. And then when it denies theology, it's denying false, bad theology. So, should anyone even think that this is the word of Allah that gets things wrong? Because if it is, then Allah doesn't know everything. He's not worthy of worship. And again, like I gave in my recent talk at that conference, how classical theism best explains the good news, and it also refutes just the concept of Allah, because Allah falls apart philosophically before even bring theology into the equation.
yeah, excellent. All right, well, here's another quote from Dr. Janosik's book, The Counter View of the Transition from Prophet to Empire. He says, some scholars assert that the Arabs who immigrated into Palestine and Syria during the later half of the 7th century were Ishmaelites who wanted to lay claim to Jerusalem under the rule of a new type of Christianity where Jesus was the Messiah and the chosen one, but not the divine Son of God. This would certainly fit with the viewpoint of John of Damascus, who was an eyewitness to many of these developments. He even named his apologetic treatise documenting the beliefs of the new rulers as the heresy of the Ishmaelites. He doesn't talk about Muslims. He doesn't talk about Islam. He talks about the heresy of the Ishmaelites. Um, I've heard some of the others talk about what does this really prove? I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but again, the point that I just made is something to consider. We don't have the word Muslim. We don't have the word Islam. We have the heresy of the Ishmaelites, which seems to suggest, again, some kind of heretical Christian group or biblical group of some kind. So we keep looking at the evidence. I've also heard, I keep saying this. I don't want to name names, but I've heard somebody say that no scholar believes this or no scholar takes this argument seriously. I've got three listed here on the screen. There are more. This is just three that I thought was noteworthy. Jeremy Johns, the director of Kalila Research Center of Oxford University, argues that there is no evidence of a Muslim state before Abdul Malik's reign. Fred M. Donner from the University of Chicago. These are reputable people. Fred M. Donner from the University of Chicago says early Islam began as a broader believers movement, including Jews and Christians. This fits very well with, I don't know the exact Quran reference, but there is a Quran reference that talks about Jews and Christians entering into paradise. He says that this happened before crystallizing as a distinct religion. And of course, Gunter Luling proposes that the Quran has roots in pre-Islamic Christian, I'm not sure how to pronounce this word, hymnody, and that early believers were non-Trinitarian Christians. So these are, again, all reputable scholars who are supporting what we're saying, supporting what Dr. Janosik is putting forth in the book. And there are more. I did some research. Tried to find, other scholars that would say the same thing, and they're out there. I wasn't as familiar with them as I was these names, so I posted them. But this is not a crazy, ridiculous idea. This is something that even people much smarter than you and I believe in. So. I also found this interesting as we look at some of the implications of the counter view regarding this transitional period. And this is coming from the first quote here is coming from Dr. Janosik's book. He says, a possible synthesis would also indicate that many narratives in the traditional account would have been fabricated or that later events would have been retrofitted to an earlier time. And he brings out this point. He says, for example, the third caliph, Uthman, is said to have burned all the other Quran manuscripts. We just talked about that earlier. That did not coincide with the official one. In Bukhari 4987, you can find this whole story. But this event is not documented in any written record from the time it supposedly occurred. So I think this is, sort of an argument from silence. But again, from a historical perspective, it's something to consider, especially considering the fact that there is documented evidence that the governor of Iraq, al-Hajjaj, who served under Abdul Malik in the early 8th century, was known for burning defective manuscripts. I found this really, really interesting. So, it's like they took some ideas of some things that were happening, during their time, and they insert them possibly into the standard Islamic narrative in Bukhari. I think is the suggestion here. But what do you think about this, Tony?
So basically, this would fall under the theory or hypothesis viewpoint that basically Islam came about much later than the traditional story says, and then everything before that was backfilled with made-up history.
Right.
That the hadith narrations were written in order to make sense of the Quran, and it was just trying to fill in that story. And you figure, how much time did they have to do that? If the caliphate, which began with Muhammad, whether it started early according to the sources or if he did exist, but later than the sources say. And I can go through my list, as you know, Olin. One of the slides that I have in that before and after the debate was these like 5 different possibilities for Islam and how it came about. But it's like, whether it happened at the time of Muhammad, according to tradition, or the exact same stuff happened, but just 50 years later, 100 years later, whatever. Either way, it goes from Muhammad and his successors to the Umayyad Empire to the Abbasid Empire, or I'm sorry, Caliphate, Umayyad Caliphate, or again, Empire, Abbasid Empire. I mean, you have ultimately the Ottoman Empire in rule until 1924. There were parts of the Ottoman Empire that fell in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, but it wasn't until 1924 that the end of this caliphate, which began with Muhammad, actually fell. 1924. You're talking 100 years ago. So whether everything happened early or it happened late, think of all that time that they've had, which kind of makes sense because we say, oh, look at these narrations are late. Even if we go by the revisionist, neo-revisionist dates on when these sources are coming out, it still falls in that long timeline that Muslims had to fill in the story. Again, whether it was early, whether it was late, whether it was someone else other than Muhammad, but they're just calling him Muhammad, regardless, they've had the time to fill in the story. It fell in 1924. And then, of course, as in one of my presentations, the Muslim Brotherhood, it was just 4 years later, in 1928, the Muslim Brotherhood was founded, and exact same goal as the Caliphate, having the world under Islamic law. But now, let's wear suits instead of, participating in jihad via the sword. Now it's this slow, methodical 100-year plan of Islamization. But again, the same end goal. But even if we say, let's just go from 1924 back, they had all the time in the world to fill in the story with the narrations. There's thousands of them. And yet we're also seeing a lot of these fall apart because of this archaeological evidence.
Speaking of archaeological evidence, let's look at some of the implications of archaeology, linguistics, and geography. We have, or at least I have talked about this several times, and I think you have as well, but Dr. Janosik says an entire additional problematic issue with the, or actually, I'm sorry, this is Peter Townsend, The Mecca Mystery. Great book. I have it on my bookshelf, and I just kind of thumbed through it a little bit. I really need to read this book. He says an entire additional problematic issue with the traditional story of Islam is the historicity of Mecca itself. This concern has increasingly arisen in recent research, which suggests that Mecca as a city did not exist in the time of Muhammad. That may have been a quote from Dr. Janosik. I'm sorry, I didn't make that very clear. But Peter Townsend, in his book, The Mecca Mystery, says Mecca could not be the birthplace of Muhammad or the Quran or even Islam. He says this on page 48. He says we don't have any primary source evidence for the city. There are numerous mentions of Taif, just 70 miles away. There's a mention of this city, but no mention of Mecca. There is an absence of the name of Mecca in any of the ancient inscriptions found in the Arabian Peninsula. So, again, this is just another piece of the puzzle, something to consider as far as historical evidence. I think it's, you have to take this into consideration. Where is the evidence for Mecca? And we're going to see here in a moment that the Quran and Hadith literature, they do not seem to be describing a place like Mecca. They seem to be describing a place that's much further north, perhaps Petra. But again, just some of the evidence there. Have you read this book, Tony, The Mecca Mystery?
I haven't. I have all three, or if this is, oh, I don't have this one.
Yeah.
I have Peter Townsend's other three, I believe. I think he has four total, or I
Yeah.
have the other two if this is the third one. But yeah, I mean, I've had them on the shelf for years and just still need to get to them. So
Yeah. Well, I'm with you. So, but thumbing through it and looking at some of these quotes really piqued my interest, and it seems like it's a really good book, one
and
worthwhile.
it basically, you know, again, back in 2011 or so when we were taking apologetics to Islam, this was shortly after Dr. Janosik received his PhD. And to me, when I took that class, it seemed like he gave us like MA level workload, I should say,
Yeah.
with the amount of work that he gave us. But at the end of the semester, I learned so much, and that's what really caused me to start focusing on Islam personally, as far as a man-made religion that people need to know about, as far as an evangelistic viewpoint of 1.8 billion people. You can't get a bigger mission field than Muslims. But yeah, I mean, I remember Dr. Janosik talking about this, and of course Dan Gibson and all his work getting into, which I think is coming up here pretty quick, is the um, archaeological evidence and topography pointing more towards Petra, especially when it comes to the Qiblas in a lot of the oldest mosques.
Yeah, I think this is some of the strongest arguments for the revisionists, because I mean, again, when you look at some of these, the way the Quran and the Hadith describes Mecca, it just doesn't fit. And he's, we're looking at some of the physical features of Mecca here, and we know that the mountains of Safa and Marwa, which mark the journey of Hagar and her quest for water, do not fit the Islamic description. I mean, anybody that's seen pictures of these two supposed mountains in Mecca, I mean, they're just a pile of rocks. They're not mountains. And it really just, I mean, just looking at it looks like something that, was contrived. It looks like something, it looks like the story's been fabricated just by, just by looking at these two supposed mountains is the first thing that comes to my mind. They're just nothing more than piles of rocks. And they're in the middle of Mecca, too, which makes, no sense. I mean, if Hagar is trying to find water, she doesn't have to go very far to find somebody to get water for her if she's this close to the city. So this just strongly indicates to me that something is fabricated here. And we also know that there are mountains called Safa and Marwa in Petra. I've done an entire presentation on some of these features as far as what the Quran says about Mecca, and how it just doesn't seem to be describing this place. It seems to be describing something else. There are no olive trees in Mecca, as Surah 6:141 suggests. There's no grass in Mecca, as Bukhari suggests or says. There's no fruit. But once again, all these things can be found in Petra. So why? I mean, the question is, why do these Islamic sources paint this picture, this inaccurate picture of Mecca? It just doesn't seem plausible to me. There are no olive trees, grass, or fruit of any kind in 7th century Mecca. There's no water, first of all. It's a desert. But if we look further north, if we look at Petra, they can be found there. All right, what about the linguistic evidence? Robert M. Kerr, a professor of comparative Semitic language or linguistics at Waterloo University suggests that the languages of the Quran places it in the context of northern Arabia, 600 miles north of Mecca, centered around the city of Petra. So everything is pointing towards Petra. He also suggests that since the Quran's vocabulary is largely borrowed from the Aramaic, especially Syriac, the liturgical language of the local churches, this further indicates that Classical Arabic had its origins in Arabia Patria of Syro-Palestine. Mark Dury, who is a PhD in linguistics, agrees. So everything is pointing north. We know this. If anybody that's watched or listened to Dr. J. Smith at all knows that, he's constantly finding this evidence that doesn't point towards Mecca, but it does point north, specifically to a city known as Petra. All right, what are the apologetics conclusions? These are just something to think about and make perhaps some talking points. Christianity did not burst into a period of conquest and expansion in the name of Jesus. Instead, they suffered intense persecution, did not advance their cause through the government or politics, and assumed poverty and suffering were a natural part of their missionary work. In contrast, the Muslim accounts claim that the empire building, which occurred in the decades after Muhammad's death, originated from a burst of religious enthusiasm and the desire to fulfill the will of Allah. However, it seems plausible that men like Abdul Malik used Islam as a tool to unify, motivate, and justify those actively involved in building and controlling the new empire. And then lastly, I like this about Dr. Janosik's book. He wants us to think about how we can use this to build a bridge. We want our Muslim friends to understand what's true. We want our Muslim friends to understand and hear the gospel. But we can make some very robust arguments for Christianity by appealing to these historical arguments, especially the gospel, the deity, death, and resurrection of Christ. And we should. I mean, I listened to Dr. Gary Habermas, his minimal facts arguments. Again, some people don't like this type of argument, but the points that he makes are valid. The evidence that he presents is certainly very useful, and I've gone to it quite often in my conversation with Muslims. We should be making these historical arguments for Christianity, but we can also cast doubt on the historical accuracy of Islam, and we can contrast how people have historically exercised free will to become Christian, while Islam has consistently had to force unbelievers to convert. So it's quite the contrast. And Muslims can't deny this history that they have. Just think about what type of religion has to force people to believe into it, to become believers by force. This is
one that claims there is no compulsion in religion.
Well, that's been abrogated. But anyhow, it's been a crazy busy week, and I don't know if I've made any sense in this presentation or not. I'm very tired, but hopefully somebody will find it useful. But any thoughts here on? I think this is the important part that we really need to consider. What are your thoughts here, Tony?
Yeah, well, as Dr. Janosik says as well, and speaking of, to touch on what you just said, I know anyone out there who's been reading along with us who did buy the book, which the link should still be available in the description of each of these videos if anyone needs a copy. But as you read through it, and then you go through each chapter with us in these videos that we do, and now finishing up chapter 4, you're going to get all the details that we wouldn't have time to cover unless we ended up doing 2 3 hour live streams. We're trying to do each one in about an hour, so we're glossing over a number of things and emphasizing other things. And as Dr. Janosik said at the end of this chapter, part of this bridge building is being honest with Muslims around us about this, always having a Christ-like attitude, always having the gospel as the goal in the conversation. We do apologetics along the way, but every apologetic should lead to the gospel. We do polemics when necessary, but every polemic should lead to the gospel. And just knowing that when we talk about the traditional story of Islam, especially because this is the one that Muslims are going to go with if they happen to know it, even that is bad enough in and of itself. I mean, I always tell people, we don't need to try to make Muhammad look bad. He looks bad enough on his own. And to look at the verses of the Quran which tell Muslims to go out and fight the people of the book, and for these abrogated verses, or the abrogated ones, I should say, being replaced by the later ones, which any Islamic scholar would say, yeah, the later one takes precedence, and it does away with the earlier, especially when you realize that the earlier ones was when Muhammad had no power, no followers, no money. And as he gained power, money, and followers, his preaching focused less on religion and more on politics. And it was about spreading Islam and doing it via the sword. And if you weren't a Christian or a Jew, it was convert or die. If you were a Christian or a Jew, you had that third choice of becoming a dhimmi and paying the poll tax to keep your head on your shoulders for another year. But if you think about, this is the traditional story, and this is how Islam spread when it's supposedly a religion of peace, which again, when any Muslim who says that either doesn't understand the definition of peace according to Islam, and that it is not the Western sense of the word peace. This doesn't mean peace and tranquility. In Islam, peace just means lack of opposition. In other words, as parts of the world come under Islamic law and they become part of this Dar al-Islam, then they're in the house of peace, quote unquote, because there's no opposition against Islam in that area. But to think of Muslims who bring up the Crusades, like, oh, you say Islam was violent in the way that it spread. Well, look at the Crusades. Number one, the Crusades was not to spread Christianity. The First Crusade was a 400-year delayed response to Islamic expansion, which is the exact details and story that we get in the Islamic tradition of how Islam spread via the sword. It spread in every direction through Muhammad and his 3 or 4 early successors. And it was the Crusades which took place to push back and to reclaim Christian territory. So just to think about how Islam spread according to the traditional narrative, and how Christianity spread according to the Christian history and world history as we know it, which is actually accurate, unlike Islamic history or its claims about Islamic history, it's completely different. It's night and day, just like the lives of Jesus and Muhammad. So they say there's no compulsion in religion. Well, there certainly is compulsion when you're leaving Islam. There's compulsion to make you stay, and there's compulsion to make you come back within 3 days or you're dead. But yes, Muslims will say, oh, there's no compulsion because even if there's a sword to your neck, we can't make you reject Christianity. We can't make you submit to Islam. You have free will. So there's no, I mean, that's, they get that nitty gritty and are grasping at straws to make the claim that there is no compulsion, when we see everything refuting that. When we look at the traditional story of Islam, which again is being refuted today by certain scholars, and there's other scholars saying, look, the traditional story is true, other than, again, the false theological parts. But either way, it's still a problem. And as you always say, Olin, we love Muslims. And I tell people we love Muslims, but I know you say you hate Islam. And when I explain that to people, I say, look, Islam's a religio-political system. It's not a person. Islam can't be offended. A Muslim could be offended, but a Muslim is a person made in the image of God who Jesus Christ died for.
Yeah.
And Islam is keeping 1.8 billion people in bondage to a lie. So that's why we don't like Islam, but we love Muslims. And we want to get the gospel to all Muslims. We want to equip all Christians to reach Muslims. And I know before we end today, we need to let people know, because I don't think we're going to do another chapter before this big event comes up.
That's right.
But next month, which I know is only a day or two away, November 15th in Pensacola, Florida, is the very. Do you have the poster, Roland? It's the very.
I never could find it. Yeah, it's on my laptop, but StreamYard show it to me.
And it should be online as well, and it's in our latest newsletter. If you don't get our newsletters, go to radicaltruth.net, sign up for our free newsletter, and they get sent out once a month, sometimes twice a month, sometimes every other month. But you will get a newsletter with all the latest news, the latest videos, the latest podcasts, upcoming events, and all that kind of stuff, or events that already took place that we didn't advertise ahead of time. But Olin and I, we both have a number of presentations that we've created, and we give these, and some topics we both speak on, some topics I speak on that he doesn't, and vice versa. But we decided to collaborate and create a brand new presentation called Grace and Truth. And this is the most well-rounded teaching that a church can get as far as explaining the gospel, our need for it, going into classical theism and explaining the true nature of God. That blows a lot of Christians' minds as far as how amazing God is. But of course, it lets people know again how, as was the title of my recent presentation, your Allah is too small, because Allah is not worthy of worship. When you see again how the attributes of Allah break down philosophically. But in the presentation, any church who says, come here and give it, and either Olin can go to your church or I can go to your church, but because we collaborated on Grace and Truth, you're going to get the same core material regardless of which one of us presents it. And we have three main parts, which is the gospel. We start off with that because, again, that's the overall solution. That's what Muslims need to know. We also get into the history of Islam and the history of it, the threat of Islam, because when we talk about Islam, we're talking about Islam according to Muhammad, quote unquote, not your Muslim neighbor who loves American freedom and would not ever want to live under Sharia. But again, we're going by the Islamic sources, and we explain that and the threat of it, and the little bit about the history of it and the goals of it. And of course, we also get into polemics, which is defending the Christian faith, polemics, which is critiquing Islam, and just sharing the gospel with Muslims in particular. So we cover all of this in Grace and Truth. It's, if we haven't done at your church, we ask for 4-hour window if we want to have lunch, if we want to have 3 sections, and we have a visual presentation the entire time. But Olin's given the first one next month, November 15th, Pensacola, Florida. So if you're in Florida, if you're within driving distance of Pensacola, make sure you go. And regardless of where you're located in the U.S., if you want a Grace and Truth workshop done at your church, contact us, email us, info@radicaltruth.net, and we will be sure to help you get a Grace and Truth event set up at your church, because this is the most well-rounded event as far as focusing on the gospel as the solution to Islam, but also letting your church know about the true threat of Islam that everyone needs to know about.
Excellent. And I was just thinking while you were talking there, I had several thoughts in mind, but then you covered them. But
Okay.
let me just reiterate that, we believe that the church is the solution. If we don't respond to Islam, who is? I mean, Islam has the secular world full. Every time I do an event or a video, I am constantly being confronted by people who say, well, they have the freedom of religion to do what they want to, just like you do. They have the freedom to worship. Leave them alone is kind of the implication. They don't really come out and say that a lot of times, but a lot of people don't realize that Islam is more political than it is religious, and of course we're still concerned about their souls, and we want to see them come to Christ. And again, that is the solution. And as the church, we're the only ones that should be stepping up to the plate, or the only ones who can step up to the plate and share and defend the historical Christian gospel. So that's what these Grace and Truth events are all about. We want to see the church equipped to go out and do what Christ has called us to do, to glorify God in this way. And folks, I just don't believe we're lacking in resources. All the evidence, all the truth is on our side. We have the answer, and that involves the church. So that's a large part of our focus. We don't just do things like this online, but I really enjoyed being in Florida the last couple of weeks and getting to meet people and talk to them, answer their questions about Islam. So this is something that really needs to happen, and I believe that God has given us a tremendous opportunity by bringing these people to us here in the United States. So share and defend the historical Christian gospel for the glory of God is what we want to do. Any closing thoughts, Tony?
Please share this with others. Please leave a comment, whether good, bad, whether you agree with us or disagree with us. We don't pay any money for advertising at all. We're just growing organically. The Lord is blessing our effort. Our podcast has been now downloaded in 126 countries. We're on about 15 different podcast platforms. If you like to listen to stuff more than watch stuff, which if you're listening to this right now, it's because you are listening to the podcast of it, which will be on the different podcast platforms. If you like to watch stuff, well, we're on multiple different platforms. In addition to the Radical Truth YouTube channel, the only channel that I have currently right now is a BitChute channel. And that's because I got banned on Vimeo back in early 2019, 2020, one of the two. And I've been on BitChute ever since then. Olin has his own YouTube channel, which is now, you change the URL, right? Is now Why Christianity Olin.
Yeah, I think that's helped some too, because YouTube added some numbers to it. And
yeah, I thought you chose that.
No,
I've seen those numbers for the longest time. I was like,
yeah.
8388 must mean something special. So
Right. Well, I just took those away and put the name on there, and I don't know. Yeah, I think it's helping, but
yeah, I just realized today we actually need to update the website because it's still linking to the previous URL.
Okay.
So that needs to be. But if anyone types in Why Christianity, though, type in the YouTube, the search area, type in Why Christianity Olin. It'll pull that up for sure. Even, you don't need to do no spaces. You can put spaces in. That's fine. But, like I said, we're on multiple different video platforms, at least 14, 15 different podcast platforms. And that's just on our own. Other people are apparently getting our RSS feed for our podcast, and they're putting it on other platforms that we're just learning about. So, of course, we have a lot of people coming to our website. Olin, in one of our upcoming newsletters, I'm going to share the 5 top things that people click on when they come to our website. And I think some of them will be very surprising to people. But we have hundreds of thousands of viewers on our website every single year. That's growing. Again, we're getting more and more views and subscribers on these channels. So please subscribe. I noticed, Olin, on our main YouTube channel, probably 90% of our viewers are not subscribed. So imagine how many more subscribers we would have if people just subscribed. Again, leave a comment. I guess if people don't leave any comments, then they just agree with you, apparently. Because usually when you trigger somebody and they don't agree with you, that's when they sometimes leave a comment. Of course, other people say, leave a positive comment. But leave a comment, leave a question. Again, subscribe to our newsletter at radicaltruth.net. Feel free to email us if you have any questions, especially if you want to have a Grace and Truth event done at your church.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Tony, for joining me tonight. And I guess we'll pick up chapter 5 next time. And until then, God bless everyone.